Hello everyone, this is Shankhan. Welcome to chapter 12 of the microservices with Spring Boot tutorial. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at Spring security, and we're going to try to understand how we can secure our endpoints, or how we can secure our APIs and allow only authenticated and authorized users to access the endpoints inside our APIs. So let's suppose we have an API or a microservice API that needs to be exposed to the clients, and we have multiple clients trying to access the endpoints of this particular API. So in a business to business or B2b security mechanism, the clients would first register themselves with our server, or register themselves with our platform, and the client would be given a username and password through which they can authenticate themselves, and each client will be given a set of username and password, and the client in turn can register users with different roles. So we can have multiple users for a single client with different roles registered to our platform, right? And inside our microservices ecosystem, we'd have the resource server that protects the endpoints or resources inside our APIs. So our APIs might have multiple endpoints, and some of the endpoints might need authentication, and the others might not need authorization. So the resource server is responsible for authorizing or protecting the endpoints inside our API, and the authorization server is responsible for checking the tokens that are provided by the clients. Now, what are tokens? So when a client would be trying to access our API, microservice API, the client would first need to generate a token, and the token would be valid for a certain amount of time that we define. So let's suppose the client goes to the authorization server and presents itself as a business partner and tries to fetch a token using the client ID and client secret that has been provided to the client, or with which the client is registered with our platform. And the client also tries to provide the username and password for the user who is trying to access the resource, right? So inside a business or inside an organization, we might have different users that would need to access our API, or that would need to access the endpoints, and different users might have different roles. So some users may have access to some or may be authorized to some resources, some endpoints, while other users of the same organization or of the same company might not be authorized to access those particular resources. So the client and the user has to authenticate herself or himself and get a token for making a call to our microservice API. And with that token, the client or the user for the business would try to access our API, and our API would try to find out, or using the token, the API would try to find out if the user is authorized to use or authorized to access the resource that she or he is trying to access, and if the user is a valid user, if the user is authentic user, and if the user is authorized to access the endpoint, the API would return the result, or API would return the response, else the authorization would fail, right? So for the demo, I have already created this project, string security demo, and if we go inside the POM for this project and take a look at the dependencies, we have Spring Boot Starter Security and Spring Cloud Starter Auth 2. So these are the two dependencies that we would need to protect our resources, or to secure our resources. And let's take a look at the endpoints inside our application or inside our API. So let's go to the controller class, and this is a very simple controller class, or this is a very simple controller, and we have the request mapping as API/v1, and we have two endpoints, one for stocks and one for time, right? And this stocks endpoint returns some random number, and the time gets the system time in milliseconds, right? So that's pretty much it for the endpoints inside this API. And what we are trying to do here is we are trying to secure this stocks endpoint, and this time endpoint can be accessed by anyone, right? So this time endpoint is not secure. So let's take a look at the security setup for this application. Let's first open up this class security Spring Security demo application. So we have this enable authorization server and Spring Boot application annotation on top of this class. So in a while we'll try to understand what authorization server is, and let's actually go to this class called authorization server configuration. So this is a configuration class, and we could have actually written this enable authorization on top of this class authorization server configuration. And this class extends authorization server configurer adapter. So if we take a look at the package for this is inside Spring Framework Security OAuth 2, and this would essentially act as an authorization server. So if we take a look at the diagram, go back to the diagram, the authorization server is responsible for checking whether a client is a valid client, and whether the user of the client is authorized to access the resource that the user is trying to access, right? So here we have the client ID and client secret, and the client secret is some string, some random string, some random numbers and special characters and alphabets. And this is actually an encoded version of this string. So secret 123 is the client secret, and ideally in a real-time project we would have all this information inside our database, but for just for a demonstration I have kept it inside the class itself, and I'm not connecting to a database, backend database. And we can also see we have a token store auto wire here, and we have a bean of token store that is getting generated here. So this is an in-memory token store. So this token store is responsible for providing the token, or responsible for generating the token based on the authenticity and the level of authority of the user who is trying to access the resource. So if a particular user is authorized, if a particular user is authentic, and if a particular user is authorized, the token store is going to generate a token for that user, and the user can that token can be used to access our endpoints, right? And we have an overridden method called configure here, and inside this we have the authentication manager and the token store setup, and there is another overridden method configure, and these are actually overloaded methods. And we have the authorization server security configurer inside this, and here we are saying that all endpoints. So when we add the security dependency to our class path, we'd be essentially exposing endpoints that can generate tokens. So here we are just saying that all endpoints that generate token should be accessible by everyone, right? And here we are actually trying to set up the client. So this client first has to register itself as a business partner with our platform. So that is exactly what we are doing here. And again, just for the demonstration, I have kept all this inside the class itself, but in a project scenario we'll be having this inside a database. So I have just used in memory client, or I'm saving the client information in memory, but in a real-time scenario we'll be saving all this information inside a database, right? And here we are setting up the client ID, we are setting up the client secret, and we're setting up the scopes for the client, and the authorized grant types for the client. We are setting up the authorities for the client, and we are setting up the access token validity in seconds for the client, right? So the access token that is going to be generated by the token store would remain valid for 60 seconds, right? So that is basically it for the authorization server. And let's take a look at the resource server. So here we are telling Spring which resources we want to which resources we would like to protect and which resources we would not like to protect. So there is one resource that we would like to protect, and if we go back to our controller, we have two resources, or we have two endpoints, and we are trying to protect the stocks endpoint, and this time endpoint should be accessible by everyone, and it should not ask for authentication and authorization. So inside this overridden method called configure, we are actually telling Spring that we are not trying to set up a session for this HTTP request. So what we are doing is we're telling http.sessionmanagement.session creation policy, and session creation policy we are setting as stateless. So we are not trying to create a session, and we are authorizing the requests and putting in the ant matchers, and we are saying /API/v1/time. So that is the name of, or that is the endpoint that we are trying to make accessible to everyone, accessible by everyone. So we are saying .permit all, so that's going to permit that's going to make this accessible by anyone and everyone. After that, we are saying .any request .authenticated. So apart from this endpoint in our API, we'll be authenticating and authorizing every request, right, or every endpoint. So that is basically it for the resource configuration. And if you take a look at this diagram, a resource server is basically responsible for protecting the endpoints that we are trying to protect, and we are setting up the configuration for which resources or which endpoints we are trying to protect and which endpoints we should be making accessible by everyone. So that is what we have done inside the resource configuration, right? And let's take a look at the security configuration class. So this class extends web security configurer adapter, and this is again inside the security config annotation package of Spring. And this is the setup for the user that we have done. So this is the password for the user. So inside, if we go back to our diagram, the client first has to register itself with the authorization server as a business partner. So for that, inside the authorization server, we have set up the client details. So the client ID and client secret would register the client as a business partner for us. And then for the client, we have to set up users. So we have to set up which user can access which resource, or which user should be having authority to access which resource and stuff. So that is again users inside the client, or users inside the organization of the client, right? And that kind of setup we are just doing inside the Spring security inside this class security configuration. So this is the password for the user, for a particular user of the client. So this is the password, and we'll be using the same password for all the users for the client. And we are choosing this bcrypt password encoder. So ideally, again, this password is supposed to be stored inside the database, and just for demonstration we have kept it inside the class, and we are not talking to a database inside in this application or inside this project. And here we have an overridden method, and we are basically providing the user detail service, and we have set up two users. So one user has username as user, and the other user has username as admin, and the password is same for both the users. So that's secret, and this is the encoded version of the plain text secret. And we have set different roles for these users. So the first user has a user role, and the next user has an admin role, and again these kind of details are supposed to be set inside the database, and for demonstration we are just setting it inside the class. And we are using an in-memory user details manager, and ideally in a project scenario we should be using the database connectivity and calling the database to access or to fetch the details of the user and to validate it with the request that we are getting in. And we have an authentication manager being here that is being created, right? So that is basically it for the classes. And now let's take a look at the resources. So let's go inside application.properties. So we just set up the server.port for this application, right, inside the application.properties file. Now let's try to run this application. So I'm going to say run as Spring Boot app. So our application is up and running. Now let's go to Postman and try to hit the endpoints. So just for a reminder, our time, so if we go to the resource configuration, we can see the time endpoint is permitted, and it should not ask for authentication and authorization. And apart from that, all other endpoints are secure, right? So let's try to access the time endpoint. So this is going to be our URL for the time endpoint, and let's try to send this and see if this works. So we have not passed any authorization or anything for this endpoint, and this seems to be working, and it gives a 200 OK response. And let's send it again. So we have another time. Send it again. Alright, so this seems to be working. Now let's try to hit the stocks endpoint. So if we take a look at this resource server configuration setup, we have the time endpoint available for all, but the other endpoints are secure. And we have, apart from the time endpoint, we have another endpoint called stocks. So let's try to hit the stocks endpoint and see how it works. So we get this message unauthorized, and the error description says full authentication is required to access this resource, right? So we actually first need to fetch a token to be able to access this endpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to this endpoint. So when we are when we add security, the OAuth dependency in our build path or inside our form as a dependency, this endpoint is provided to us so that we can hit this URL to get a token for our user. And for this, inside the params, we need to pass the username, the password, and the grunt type. So this is these details are the user details. So if we go back to this diagram, the client first has to show itself up to the authorization server, or the client has to provide the credentials for the authorization server to understand that this is a valid client. So that we are doing using this authorization tab, and inside the authorization we are just saying basic auth, and we have provided the username as client1 and the password as secret123. So that is the client setup that we have done here. So the client ID is client1 and the secret is 123. So that is exactly what we are doing here, is username and password. That is a client which identifies itself, or which authenticates itself. So the client first needs to authenticate itself and let the authorization server know that this is actually a legit client. And inside the client we might have multiple users, right? And we might have multiple users registered to our platform, and different users might have different sets of authority, or different sets of visibility to our APIs. So here inside the params we are actually presenting the user. So the user name is admin, the password is secret, and the grunt type is password, right? So that is something that we have set up here inside the security configuration. So this is the secret that we are passing. So this is the user setup, and the password is secret, and the username is admin. So we have two users, one is admin and another is user, and the two users have different roles, right? And here we are authenticating the user for the client, right? And let's hit send. Okay, so we get the access token, and we need to grab this access token. We need to copy this access token, and for the stocks endpoint we need to actually pass in a header, an extra header called authorization. And for the value of that, for the value of this key authorization, we need to pass in the bearer and the value of the bearer token. And if you click on send, we can see we get the stock price. And if we go back to this, we can see this expires in 59 seconds, right? And if we click on send again, this time has come down to 16. So if we hit it again, we get it. And if we go back here and send, so this expires in 2 seconds. Now if I hit this again, this would throw an exception, or this would not return the result to me, and it says access token expired. So this token is valid for 60 seconds, and that we have defined inside this authorization server configuration, and we have set the access token validity to 60 seconds, right? So after every 60 seconds we would need to fetch a new token and present that to our API, or present that to our endpoint. And if the token is valid, if the user is authorized, the result would be shown, else we won't be showing the result, right? And let's send this again and get a new token. So this is a new token. Let's copy this and let's go back to this. Let's paste the token here and let's send this. So we can see we get the stock price again. Now let's change this, or let's tamper this token. So instead of C, I'm just gonna say D, and if I send this, it says invalid token, invalid access token, right? So the token has to be validated, or the token has to be valid for this API to return a result. And this token would tell us if the user, this token has all details for the user, and this token is going to tell us if the user is authentic and if the user has authority to access the this resource or this endpoint, right? So that is a very basic lesson about string security, and there's much more that we can do about string security, and I would encourage you guys to learn more about string security. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy, please give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching.